I only needed somewhere to sleep. Then that old anvil felt like it was hiding something.
No room, no family bed, no job to return to, just a canvas tool roll and $7 she had kept folded beneath the lining of her winter coat. And with that $7, she bought an antique fencing foil forge outside Pawtucket in Providence County, Rhode Island, abandoned from local maps since 1989. The forge roof sagged above the eastern wall. Its brick chimney had split nearly to the flashing. The county condemned the workshop on October 14, 2022, with a demolition planned for the following spring. Inside a double-walled cavity sealed into the horn of a battered 150-pound anvil waited money, a steel rose, and a forgotten manual no living owner had opened in decades. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Clara Mercer had been bending her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she learned early that broken things were not always thrown away. Her father disappeared from the household before she was old enough to remember the sound of his voice, and her mother, Ruth, survived by measuring every week in rent envelopes, bus fares, and groceries bought close to closing time. Clara kept bent nails in jars and straightened them against the back step because new nails cost money. Ruth was not cruel. She was tired in a way that made tenderness seem expensive. She worked laundry shifts, slept with one hand beneath her cheek, and taught Clara to rinse a plate before the last food dried hard upon it. What she could not teach was what to do when obedience did not protect you. That lesson came from Ruth's father, Elias Mercer. Every Saturday until Clara was 14, Elias collected her in a green Ford pickup whose passenger door required lifting before it would latch. He repaired clocks, farm tools, hinges, and once a cracked brass baptismal font, but his first trade had been metalwork. Behind his house stood a narrow shed with a coal forge, a post vise, and a square-faced anvil polished pale where decades of hammer blows had landed. He never let Clara swing the heavy hammer at first. Instead, she pumped the leather bellows. She watched black iron turn dull red, then cherry, then a yellow so bright it seemed to have its own weather. Elias taught her to hold tongs without strangling them, to listen when steel changed pitch beneath a hammer, and to clean the forge every Sunday morning before church bells carried over the rooftops. Their ritual ended with tea poured from an enamel pot blackened underneath by coal smoke. Elias would place whatever they had repaired between them and inspect it in silence, a thing that Ben's has not necessarily failed. He said it only once. Clara remembered because he made her straighten a warped fireplace poker immediately afterward, heating it slowly and correcting it by degrees rather than striking it flat. Force, he showed her, was sometimes the quickest way to finish breaking what had already survived. Elias died during Clara's 15th winter after a stroke that left his workshop lamp burning until a neighbor noticed it after midnight. Ruth sold the house within 4 months. The forge tools went with an estate lot. The notebooks vanished into boxes Clara never saw again, and the small steel pieces Elias had wrapped in oiled cloth were taken by a dealer who paid cash at the kitchen table. Clara kept only the canvas tool roll. 5 years later, she was trimming clay from the foot of porcelain bowls at a pottery works south of Providence. The manager, Vernon Pike, wore narrow black suspenders and carried a pencil sharpened at both ends. He controlled the kiln room by schedule, the loading benches by chalk marks, and the workers by making silence feel like an accusation. A crooked cup could cost someone an hour. A delayed firing became a lecture delivered softly enough that everyone else stopped moving to hear it. On December 3rd, Vernon ordered a rolling rack loaded beyond the weight Clara had warned him its upper braces could bear. The right caster struck a broken floor joint. 3 shelves leaned. Vernon grabbed the frame from the wrong side. Porcelain fell for 11 seconds. Clara remembered the sound more than anything afterward. Hundreds of pieces breaking in overlapping waves, delicate rims becoming white fragments beneath iron wheels. By noon, Vernon had written the accident report. Her name was on it. By 2, she was dismissed. The final wages did not cover what she already owed at the rooming house, and 3 nights later the landlady placed Clara's canvas tool roll on the front stoop beside a cardboard box softened by sleet. Ruth came after receiving Clara's message, stood under the porch lamp in her old wool coat, and looked from her daughter to the landlady. Clara waited for her mother to open the passenger door. Ruth kept both hands around her purse. The landlady slid the key from Clara's fingers. "You need to take your things and leave." Ruth lowered her eyes. That was all. Clara carried the box to the bus shelter alone. For 6 weeks she learned the private geography of having nowhere to belong. In Providence, she slept 2 nights sitting upright in the 24-hour waiting area near Kennedy Plaza until a guard began recognizing her coat. In Central Falls, she found an unlocked laundromat where the dryers warmed the air until 3 in the morning, spending 75 cents at a time so she could appear to be a customer. Her money diminished by objects: $1.25 for oatmeal, 90 cents for a bus, $2 for socks after the old pair split at both heels. She walked to Pawtucket when she could, following Broad Street beneath dirty January snow, and spent daylight hours inside public buildings because warmth without purchase had become something she could identify from a block away. At the Pawtucket Public Library, she learned which chair received afternoon sun. She washed in the restroom, read repair manuals, and kept her coat folded behind her back so no one could see where the lining had torn. By the 4th week, she had $11.38. By the 6th, after food and buses and one night in a church shelter when the temperature fell below 12 degrees, she had $7 left untouched. The 7 had been separate from everything else. Emergency money. Elias once called such bills. On January 17th, Clara was turning the pages of a discarded classified circular near the library radiator when one advertisement stopped her hand. County liquidation. Former fencing foil forge and workshop. Pawtucket outskirts. Structure condemned. Contents included. As is transfer. $7. Buyer assumes liability. Someone had circled the word demolition in blue pencil. Below it was a parcel number and an office address. Clara read the advertisement 3 times. She knew almost nothing about fencing foils. She knew even less about condemned property. But beside the listing was a grainy photograph of an old forge room, and in its center stood an anvil with a long, narrow horn. The shape stopped her. Elias had once drawn such an anvil in charcoal on brown wrapping paper while explaining how thin steel should be persuaded rather than bullied. Clara could still see his thumb rubbing coal dust from one corner of the sketch. At 4:10 that afternoon, she returned the circular to the table, then took it back. She folded the page into quarters. The next morning, carrying 1 canvas roll, 1 borrowed library pencil, and every dollar she had left, Clara Mercer began walking toward the county office to buy a place everyone else had already decided was finished. The $7 would get her through the door, but the old anvil inside would decide what happened after. Clara left the county office district before sunrise with the folded classified in her pocket and a paper cup filled from the library fountain. The first bus carried her north through Pawtucket, past brick mill walls blackened by a century of rain, and left her 3.5 miles from the parcel because the driver said the winter route no longer went farther. She walked. The road narrowed between frozen drainage ditches, then climbed past abandoned machine sheds where snow had blown beneath warped doors. By dusk, her socks were wet through. She found an open-sided hay barn behind an unused dairy field and slept between 2 square bales with her coat wrapped over her head. The temperature fell to 14 degrees. She woke twice to stamp feeling back into her feet. Morning brought a pale sky and another more miles on foot. Near the older edge of Pawtucket, she passed Delaney's Hardware, Bell Street Cafe, Corcoran Coal and Oil, Whitman Shoe Repair, and Pereira's Market. 5 narrow businesses pressed into brick storefronts as if holding one another upright against the cold. Clara did not go to the property first. She went to the county clerk. The office occupied the first floor of a sandstone municipal annex where wet boots had worn shallow crescents into the entry tiles. Behind a high oak counter sat a woman with silver hair clipped so tightly at the back of her head that not one strand moved when she looked up. Her brass nameplate read, "Margaret Haskell, Deputy Property Clerk." Clara placed the classified on the counter. Mrs. Haskell looked at the paper, then at Clara's coat, then at the canvas tool roll hanging from her shoulder. You understand the roof has active structural failure? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no certified electrical service? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county has not tested the well? Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition costs become yours after transfer? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Haskell removed her glasses. For several seconds she did nothing. Then she opened a gray ledger thick enough to stop a door. The $7 is not the property's value, she said. It is the administrative minimum for an abandoned liability transfer. Clara unfolded the bills. I have 7, I can see that. One corner of Mrs. Haskell's mouth moved, though not quite into a smile. The deed required 6 signatures, 3 initials, and a written acknowledgment that Clara accepted every structure and object on the parcel as found. Mrs. Haskell turned each page herself, tapping the correct line with one square fingernail. When Clara finished, the clerk placed a brass hand stamp over the deed. The mechanism came down with a heavy metallic clap. That sound changed everything more quietly than Clara expected. Mrs. Haskell slid the stamped document across the counter. Take Mineral Spring Avenue west, then turn north where the old Sales Mill spur crosses the drainage cut. You'll see a gravel lane after the stone culvert. No sign at the road anymore. Clara folded the deed carefully. Mrs. Haskell had begun returning the ledger to its shelf when she stopped Mercer. Clara looked up. The clerk was studying the signature. Elias Mercer, my grandfather. Mrs. Haskell's hand remained on the ledger. The metal worker. Clara said nothing at first. He repaired things. He did more than repair things. Mrs. Haskell came back to the counter. My father knew his name. Every machine shop from Pawtucket to Central Falls knew it for a while. Springs, hardened pins, fine tool work. He could temper narrow stock without leaving it glass brittle. Clara felt the canvas roll against her hip. He never told me that. Men from that generation often mistook silence for modesty. Mrs. Haskell glanced toward the hallway before lowering her voice. There was a fencing smith near the old mill district. Specialized work. Foils, practice sabers, replacement blades for clubs in Providence and Boston. Your grandfather visited that shop. How do you know? My father drove deliveries. The room seemed suddenly smaller. Was it this forge? Mrs. Haskell looked at the deed. I cannot prove that. She pushed it the final inch toward Clara, but I would look carefully before throwing anything away. Outside, snow had begun again. Clara walked west with the deed inside her coat. Mineral Spring Avenue carried enough traffic to keep its center wet and black, but the side roads were crusted white. At the old spur, she found the drainage cut and followed a gravel lane beyond a stone culvert exactly as Mrs. Haskell had instructed. Halfway in, an elderly man splitting kindling beside a green mailbox raised one gloved hand. A yellow dog stood beside him without barking. You going to the forge? Clara stopped. I think so. The man rested his hatchet against the stump. Then you're the first person headed up there on purpose in years. The dog sniffed the air in Clara's direction. Lane forks past the walnuts, the man said. Keep left, right side washes out. Thank you. He nodded once. The dog followed her with its eyes until she disappeared around the bend. 4 black walnut trees marked the last rise. Beyond them stood the forge. It was smaller than the photograph had made it seem. Roughly 24 feet wide and 40 feet long, built of dark red brick over a granite foundation. A low timber-framed addition leaned from the rear. The roof was cedar shingle beneath later patches of rolled asphalt, and the chimney rose crookedly from the eastern slope with 2 courses missing near its cap. Above the double doors hung a faded wooden sign. Only 3 words remained readable beneath lichen, Mercer fencing. Still Clara stopped walking, snow collected on her shoulders. Mercer. She set down the tool roll and stared until cold entered her gloves. The clerk had said Elias visited the shop. The sign suggested something more. A rusted hasp held one door loosely against the frame. The county had left a new padlock hooked through it but not closed. Clara removed it, pulled hard, and the door opened 6 inches before dragging across debris. She put her shoulder against the wood. Inside, the air smelled of coal dust, wet brick, mouse nesting, and old oil. The silence had weight. Her boots disturbed a gray skin of ash across the floor. Somewhere in the rafters, water tapped slowly into a metal pan with a sound like a patient clock. The front room had once been the working forge. A brick hearth occupied the east wall beneath a broad iron hood. Broken foil blades lay in one corner, narrow lengths of steel curled and rusted into shapes resembling dried vines. A pair of tongs sat open on the floor. At the center stood the anvil. Its face was dark, its long horn pointed toward the door. Clara touched it. The metal was colder than the air and left rust on her fingertips. She moved into the back room, where a workbench ran beneath two cracked windows. There was a hand-cranked grinder, a wooden rack with empty blade slots, and a narrow iron stove containing the remains of some final fire long collapsed into powder. The room tasted faintly metallic when she breathed through her mouth. She found mouse droppings in a drawer, a rain-swollen blanket in a cabinet, and one unopened jar of cloves so old that the scent remained trapped beneath the lid. When she twisted it open, the sudden sweetness filled the room for a moment and made the ruin around her seem almost inhabited. By dark, she had cleared a rectangle of floor beside the cold stove. She laid cardboard beneath her coat, placed the canvas tool roll under her head, and ate half a heel of bread she had saved from the cafe district. Wind pressed against the cracked windows. The building answered with small noises. Roof timber settling, loose flashing ticking, one chain moving softly against brick. Clara could see the anvil through the open doorway. Moonlight found the edge of its horn. She remembered Elias correcting the warped poker by fractions, heating it, turning it, refusing to strike harder merely because the work was slow. For the first time in 6 weeks, Clara slept somewhere she had the legal right to remain, a thing that Ben's has not necessarily failed. By the third morning, Clara had learned which floorboard near the stove complained before taking weight and which one beside the back wall gave no warning at all. She marked the dangerous board with a piece of chalk. The well stood 40 yards behind the forge under a leaning cedar cover. She lowered the bucket until the rope slackened, brought up water clear enough to see the iron hoop through it, then boiled every cup before drinking. The outhouse listed toward a stone wall and had one door hinge working, so she repaired the other with wire from the tool roll. These were small victories. They gave the day shape. On the fourth morning, she walked back toward the row of businesses she had passed on arrival and entered Delaney's Hardware. A brass bell struck once above the door. The store smelled of kerosene, pine shelving, fertilizer dust, and the warm, metallic odor of hundreds of loose fasteners kept in wooden drawers. Behind the counter stood a broad man with a white mustache cut flat across his upper lip as if someone had trimmed it with a ruler. He was sorting carriage bolts by touch. Morning, morning. Clara placed a short list on the counter. The man looked at it, then at her coat. You bought the fencing place. She had begun to understand that news traveled faster than people on that road. Yes. He held out one hand, Walter Delaney, Clara Mercer. The bolts stopped clicking. Mercer, she waited. Walter did not ask the question. Instead, he picked up her list. You paying cash? I have almost none. That complicates retail, I know. He read the paper again. You planning to stay? Yes. How long? Clara looked toward a shelf of lamp chimneys. I do not know. Walter scratched the edge of his mustache. That's a better answer than most. He opened a ledger. I'll give you 30 days on necessities, not luxuries. If I think something is a luxury, it is. Clara nodded. And if you disappear, I own whatever you leave behind that I can carry. All right. Walter wrote Mercer and Forge in the ledger, then reached beneath the counter and produced a stained paperback. Home repairs for old buildings. The spine had been repaired with cloth tape. This is free. I cannot take, you can. Nobody buys manuals anymore until after they've ruined something. He began totaling her order. A chimney brush was $3.40 and 50 feet of rope cost $1.85. A tin of stove cement was $1.10. Heavy work gloves were $2.25. A gallon of kerosene was $1.32. A small sack of rock salt was 80 cents. Walter tapped the list. Do not climb that chimney from the roof. I wasn't planning to. You were. Clara said nothing. Drop the brush from above only after somebody tells you the crown will hold. Until then, clean upward from the hearth. How? He took the free manual back, turned to a chapter, and folded one corner. Like this. Clara returned carrying the supplies in 2 canvas sacks. The chimney took most of the next day. She removed the rusted stovepipe first, covered the floor with flattened feed sacks found in the rear cabinet, and tied the round wire brush to 3 threaded rods Walter had loaned her. Working from the hearth opening, she pushed upward one section at a time, rotating the rods clockwise so the joints would not unscrew inside the flue. The first 6 feet gave only gray dust. Above that, the brush caught. Clara pulled. Nothing. She pushed again, twisted twice, and a slab of creosote broke loose overhead. It struck the hearth floor like black pottery. More followed. Dry flakes first, then thick glazed pieces with a hard sheen along one side where years of smoke had condensed against cold masonry. She worked for 5 hours, stopping whenever her shoulders cramped, until the brush finally moved through the upper throat without resistance. The pile filled half a coal scuttle. She carried it outside. The chimney still needed masonry work, but the lower flue was open. That evening she sealed 2 gaps around the stove collar with cement, waited until the surface skinned over, then built a test fire no larger than both her hands. 1 twist of newspaper, 6 dry splinters, 3 pieces of old oak from beneath the workbench. The smoke hesitated. Clara crouched beside the stove door, then the draft took. The flame leaned inward. A thin ribbon of smoke rose correctly into the chimney. She sat on the floor and watched it for nearly an hour. Her first hot meal in the forge was oats cooked in well water inside a dented enamel saucepan Walter had added to her account without comment. She stirred in half an apple and a pinch of salt. Steam touched her face. She ate beside the stove with both hands around the bowl. The next morning she began cleaning the workroom. Not everything deserved saving. Rotten leather straps went outside. Mouse-chewed paper went into the stove. Rusted nails beyond use filled 1 bucket. What remained began forming a pattern. There were 6 long forging tongs with jaws narrow enough for blade stock. A swage block carried grooves no wider than a finger. 3 wooden blade forms hung on the wall, each slightly different in taper. A hand-cranked sandstone wheel stood beneath a leather drip cup. On a shelf she found a box of brass foil guards, green with oxidation. 2 quenching tanks sat beneath the bench, one marked oil in faded white paint, and beneath everything, at the center of the room, waited the anvil. Clara scrubbed its face with kerosene and coarse cloth. The steel brightened slowly. The anvil weighed perhaps 150 pounds, maybe more, with a square heel, a hardy hole, and a long horn intended for drawing curves and narrow tapers. One edge of the face had chipped away. The horn bothered her. Not because it was damaged, because it sounded wrong. She discovered it accidentally while moving scrap. A short piece of steel slipped from her hand and struck the anvil's waist. Ring. She picked it up and struck the heel. Ring, then the horn. Tonk-dock. Clara stopped. She struck again. The sound was duller near the tip. A forged anvil was not uniform in tone. Elias had taught her that much, but the difference was too sharp. She took the smallest hammer from her roll and began tapping along the horn at 2-inch intervals. Clear, clear, then hollow. She marked the place with chalk. The next test was crude but useful. Using a pry bar and a timber block, she raised one side enough to slip a bathroom scale beneath each foot separately. She repeated the measurements twice, adding the readings and correcting for the uneven floor as best she could. The result was strange. The anvil was lighter than its dimensions suggested by nearly 12 pounds. Clara sat back on her heels. Along the underside of the horn, thick scale concealed what looked at first like a forging seam. She scraped with the point of a file. Rust came away. Beneath it was a line too straight to be accidental. A weld. Not structural, a closure. For the next hour she did almost nothing except clean that line. She used kerosene, a brass brush, and finally the thin edge of a broken hacksaw blade. The seam curved around an oval section beneath the horn and disappeared into old hammered texture so carefully that someone standing upright would never notice it. At the center was a circle the size of a silver dollar. Wood. Clara pressed her thumbnail against it. Cedar. Dry, dark, and fitted flush into the steel. She did not pry it immediately. She boiled water, ate, swept the bench, then returned. Using the point of a narrow awl, she worked around the cedar disc by fractions until one edge lifted. The smell reached her first. Cedar and old oil. She pulled the disc free. Behind it lay darkness. Clara inserted one finger. A cavity continued deep into the horn. Something inside was wrapped in cloth. She fetched the long needle-nosed tongs from the wall. The first package emerged reluctantly, bound in waxed linen blackened by age. The second was narrower. Behind them came a cylindrical roll, then a small rectangular tin that scraped against the cavity before dropping into her palm. She laid everything on the cleaned bench. She opened the narrow package first. Inside were 3 heirloom tools, a delicate spring caliper, a small chasing hammer with an octagonal handle, and a hardened steel gauge cut with graduated slots for blade thickness. The second bundle held lengths of untouched high-carbon steel wrapped in oiled paper. Each strip was narrow. Each had a number stamped near one end. The cylindrical roll contained a thin handwritten manual tied with cotton cord. Clara did not open it. Not yet. The tin box was heavier. Its lid resisted until she slid a screwdriver beneath one corner. The seal released with a small breath. Inside were cloth rolls, money, not bills alone, coins. Clara closed the lid again. She stood very still. Then she locked the front door. For the next 2 hours, she counted everything twice. There were paper notes folded beneath the coin rolls, old but spendable by denomination. There were Morgan silver dollars, Barber half dollars, Liberty head gold pieces, and several Indian head quarter eagles wrapped separately in tissue. One coin had been drilled and threaded with red cord. It was not a coin. It was a medal, a World War I victory medal, dated 1919, on a handwritten paper tag tied behind the suspension ring. Clara placed it apart from the money. When she finished the second count, she wrote the total on the back of an empty hardware receipt. $33,500. She checked again. The same, $33,500 hidden inside an Anvil horn in a condemned forge sold for $7. Beneath the final coin roll, she found one more object, a rose. It had been forged from stainless steel no larger than her palm. 5 petals curled outward from a welded stem, each hammered so thin at the edge that light passed silver along it. Clara turned it carefully. The petals flexed. They did not crack. Under the rose lay an envelope. Her name was not written on it. There were only 5 words. For the one who stays. Clara looked at the rolled manual, then at the envelope. Outside, evening had lowered across the walnut trees. She could have opened both. She did not. She wrapped the coins again, placed the medal beside the steel rose, and carried the envelope to the table without breaking its seal. Then she walked out the back door. Snowmelt had begun moving beneath the frozen skin of the drainage channel beyond the forge. Water slid darkly between shelves of ice, making a quiet sound where it passed over stones. Clara stood there until her fingers hurt from cold. All her life, money had disappeared quickly. Rent, food, bus fare, coal. $7 had been something to guard because once spent it was gone. Now enough money to change the direction of her life sat inside a tin box 20 steps behind her, and she found that she did not want to touch it until she understood why someone had hidden it. The water kept moving beneath the ice. A thing that bends has not necessarily failed. Morning came gray through the cracked western panes. Clara lit the stove, warmed her hands over it, and brought the envelope to the bench. The paper had yellowed unevenly, darker where fingers had once held its corners. When she turned it over, she recognized the handwriting before she understood why. The capital M, Elias, had formed his the same way. Not identical, inherited. Clara broke the seal. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this, then the horn opened for you because you looked closely enough to notice what others passed by. My name is Miriam Mercer Vale. In March of 1988, Dr. Samuel Green at Rhode Island Hospital in Providence told me I had pancreatic cancer and perhaps 6 months if the disease followed the course he expected. I had already lived 78 years, which seemed less unfair than it sounded when he said it aloud. This shop began before me. My great-grandfather, Thomas Mercer, born in 1829 in Sheffield, England, came to Providence in 1854 with a hammer, a set of spring steel gauges, and almost no money. His son, Edwin Mercer, born in 1858 in Pawtucket, began making fencing blades for private academies along the East Coast in the 1880s. Edwin's daughter, Clara Mercer, born in 1878, learned to forge narrow stock beside him and kept the shop through the first years of the new century. Her son, Elias Mercer, born in 1915, learned here before carrying the work elsewhere when trade changed and orders declined. Yes, Elias, if you knew him, then perhaps this letter has traveled a shorter distance than I feared. The forge closed officially on September 30, 1956. After that came more than 30 years of silence. My husband Daniel Vale was killed in France during the First World War before he ever saw the son we had planned to raise here. Some losses enter a room and never fully leave it. I kept his victory medal because work was the only language I had for what remained. If you intend to make blades, do not begin with speed. For high carbon spring stock, bring the working heat to a clean cherry red near 1050 degrees Fahrenheit, and do not hammer once the color falls below a dull red. Normalize 3 times, each heat lower than the last before hardening. Quench in warm oil, not water. Keep the oil near 120 degrees if the room is cold, and move the blade edgewise so no vapor pocket clings to one face. Temper between 725 and 775 degrees Fahrenheit according to section thickness, holding long enough for the color to travel evenly through the blade. A foil that cannot bend deeply and return straight is not finished merely because it looks straight on the bench. Draw the taper patiently. Measure often. A little too much removed at the wrong place cannot be hammered back. You will find my notes with the steel. Do not treat them as commandments. They are records of mistakes paid for and broken blades. There is money here because there was no one left whom I trusted to inherit the shop honestly. Money without work becomes merely permission to leave. I hoped it might instead give someone enough time to stay. Use it slowly. Repair what keeps out weather. Keep the old tools working where they still serve. Replace what has become dangerous without pretending decay is sacred. Inheritance is not ownership. It is the obligation to leave a thing more usable than you found it. The steel rose was made from an offcut in 1941. Bend one petal gently between 2 fingers. You will understand why I kept it. Sharpness is useful. Resilience is rarer. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Miriam Mercer Vale. July 22, 1988. Clara read the letter twice. The second time, she stopped at Elias's name but did not touch the page. Then she folded the sheets along their original creases, exactly where Miriam had folded them nearly 4 decades earlier, and returned them to the envelope. Outside, the morning wind had weakened. Clara went through the back door carrying the letter. Miriam had written one final sentence below the signature in smaller ink, almost as an afterthought. If the walnut survives, look for Elias's mark where the north root divides. Clara crossed the frozen yard. The oldest walnut stood beyond the drainage channel, with one root lifted above the soil like the back of a buried hand. Snow had gathered in the fork. She brushed it away. Cut into the wood near ground level was a small mark, 3 short lines beneath a narrow V. The same mark appeared on the steel thickness gauge from the anvil. Clara put 2 fingers against it. Elias had stood here. That was enough. Back inside, she placed the World War I medal beside the stove and took the old enamel lamp she had found on a shelf in the workroom. Its wick was stiff but intact. She cleaned the burner, filled the reservoir with a little kerosene from Delaney's, and struck a match. The flame rose unevenly, then steadied. For the first time in years, one of the forge's old lamps held light again. Clara watched it illuminate the bench. Walter Delaney had given credit to a stranger who owned nothing worth securing, Mrs. Haskell had taken extra time to explain the road and then spoken Elias's name when she might have simply filed the deed. The bus driver had warned Clara where the winter route ended instead of leaving her farther from shelter. And the elderly man near the green mailbox had pointed her toward the safe fork while his yellow dog stood quietly beside him. None of them had changed her life alone. That was not how kindness usually worked. It arrived in pieces small enough to overlook, then waited until a person had enough of them to build something sturdy. Before we move on, think of one small kindness someone gave you when they did not have to. Maybe it was a meal, a ride, a tool, A few patient words or simply a door held open at the right moment. Tell us about that person in the comments if you still remember their name. That night, Clara wrapped the caliper, chasing hammer and steel gauge in fresh cloth, and placed them beside her bedroll. The letter remained beneath the lamp. The steel rose lay on top of it. Before sleeping, Clara bent one thin petal gently toward the stem. It yielded almost to her finger. When she released it, the metal returned. The first real snow came on December 2nd and measured 7 inches against the north foundation by morning. Clara spent that day inside with the repair manual open beside the lamp. She read the roofing chapter 3 times. The forge measured roughly 24 by 40 feet, but the damaged eastern slope was smaller than the whole roof. She calculated the repair area twice, allowed for overlap and waste, then wrote the numbers in pencil on a scrap of flour sack. 11 squares of cedar shingles for the affected sections, 3 rolls of felt, and just under 20 pounds of galvanized roofing nails. Walter Delaney corrected one number. You forgot breakage. He added another bundle of shingles to the account. Then he reached beneath a cabinet and brought out a roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle dark from use. My brother's, he said. He won't need it. Clara looked at him. Walter busied himself with a drawer of hinges. Bring it back when the roof stops leaking. The man who taught her how to use it arrived 2 mornings later. Arthur Bell was 72, a retired roofer with one finger missing above the first joint and knees that made him descend ladders sideways. He examined the sagging eastern slope from the ground, walked the perimeter twice, then asked Clara what she planned to pay him. I cannot pay you enough. Good. He removed his cap. Then we've settled it. They opened the roof carefully rather than tearing everything away. One rafter had split beside an old knot, so Arthur showed Clara how to sister it with a sound length of timber bolted alongside the weakened member. They stretched a chalk line across the new sheathing, snapped blue guides, laid felt from the eave upward, and staggered shingle joints so water would never find a straight path inside. Arthur taught nails by sound. 3 strokes, set, dot drive, seat. On the 4th morning, Clara struck too softly. Arthur pointed with the roofing hatchet. That nail's proud. Clara raised the hammer again. Pull it. She did. They worked 11 days. Snow melted on the southern pitch at noon and froze again before dark. Clara learned to keep nails inside her coat so her fingers did not fumble them, to shift her weight before reaching, and never to trust a board merely because it had held yesterday. By December 14th, the eastern roofline was straight enough to cast one clean shadow. That night, rain replaced snow. Clara woke twice listening. No drip touched the metal pans. January exposed what the first fire had hidden. The chimney bricks above the roofline were spalling. Their faces flaked off beneath Clara's fingertips, and the mortar between them had become pale powder that could be scraped out with a spoon handle. Walter told her Portland cement would be too hard for the old brick and sold her hydraulic lime instead. Arthur gave only one instruction: match the wall, not your pride. Clara mixed 2 parts clean sand to 1 part hydraulic lime for the outer joints, then used a fire clay-rich mortar closer to the hot flue, approximately 2 parts fire clay to 1 part lime binder, adjusting with sand until the mix held on the trowel without slumping. The work lasted 3 weeks. Most mornings remained in the 20s Fahrenheit. Mortar could not be trusted if allowed to freeze before it set, so she worked in small sheltered sections, wrapping repaired courses with old canvas at dusk and warming the masonry gently from below. She refused thick gloves because she could not feel the joints through them. Every 15 minutes her bare fingers went numb. She would climb down, hold them near the stove until the ache returned, then go back up. Old mortar came out to sound depth. New mortar went in by layers. The worst bricks were replaced with salvaged ones from a collapsed interior partition, each cleaned by hand before reuse. In late January, Clara built the first serious test fire. Dry oak caught. The flame leaned toward the flue. She went outside. Smoke rose from the rebuilt chimney in one narrow gray column without curling back beneath the eaves. She stood in the snow until the smoke became almost invisible against the sky. The floors came next because winter dirt had revealed every hollow, splinter, and patch. Most of the original boards were white pine, wide enough that Clara could span 1 plank with both hands. Where boards were missing, she found reclaimed white pine of similar age and fastened it with hand-cut rose-head nails driven into old joists after pilot holes were bored to prevent splitting. She wanted to preserve wear, not erase it. That distinction took practice. Walter rented her a random orbit sander for $14 per day. Return it before closing, I will. You said that about the roof hatchet. It is still working, so am I. She sanded in 3 passes. 80 grit removed the blackened surface and high splinters. 120 softened the machine marks. 220 was used sparingly, mostly by hand near walls and repaired sections where too much polishing would make the new boards look falsely perfect. Dust entered everything. Her sleeves, her hair, the cracks around the stove. When the floor was clean, she applied the first coat of oil with cloth pads, working toward the doorway so she would not trap herself in a corner. The wood darkened immediately. What had appeared gray-brown under dirt became deep honey, then moved toward mahogany as the second and third coats settled into the old pine. She waited 48 hours after the final coat before placing furniture back. There was one morning when she did none of it. She woke before daylight with the sander waiting beside the wall and simply could not lift it, so she walked to the marsh. A great blue heron stood in shallow water between reeds glazed with ice. Clara watched it for nearly an hour. The bird did not hurry. It raised 1 foot, waited, placed it down, and waited again. Clara returned to the forge after noon. She cleaned 1 brush, nothing more. The following morning she finished the floor. There were 8 windows in the forge and living rooms. 3 had no glass, 4 had panes cracked from corner to corner. 1 surviving pane was original, identified by the wavy imperfections in the glass and a date scratched lightly into the sash. 1788. Clara would not replace it. She removed that sash first, wrapped the pane in 2 blankets, and stored it flat while the frame was repaired. For the others, Walter helped her order salvaged glass close enough in thickness that the windows would not look newly inserted into an old face. Clara stripped the failed putty carefully. She softened stubborn sections with gentle heat, pulled glazing points with narrow pliers, bedded each replacement pane, then rolled Diap 33 glazing putty between her palms before pressing it into the rabbet. Her first bevel was ugly. Walter looked at it too steep. She scraped it out. The next was better. By the 4th window, she could draw the putty knife along the line in 1 slow pass, keeping the interior edge just below the sight line of the muntin. The sash cords were worse. Several had rotted inside the weight pockets. She replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, feeding the line over the pulley, tying a figure-8 knot at each counterweight, then testing the travel before closing the access panel. 1 weight dropped the first time. It struck the pocket bottom hard enough to make Clara jump. She reopened the panel, retied the knot, tested again. On February 27th, she rehung the final sash. The preserved 1788 pane went back into its repaired frame last. Clara pressed the sash upward. It moved without binding. Outside, a chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch less than 6 feet from the glass. For several seconds, the bird faced the window. Clara stood with 1 hand still on the sash cord. Then the chickadee flicked its wings and vanished toward the creek. She lowered the window gently until the latch met. The wall beside the chimney failed 3 times before Clara understood what it wanted. The original interior was horsehair plaster pressed over hand-split oak lath, and every modern patch she tried near the warm masonry cracked along its edge after drying. The first split overnight. The second loosened when the stove ran hot. The third held 2 days, then opened like a pale seam. Walter brought her an old paper sack from his storage room. Horsehair, he said. My father kept everything. Clara mixed lime plaster and worked the fibers through it by hand. She rebuilt the damaged areas in 3 coats, a scored scratch coat forced between the oak lath, a 3/8-inch brown coat left 72 hours to cure, then a 1/8-inch finish coat laid thin beneath a damp trowel. She did not sand away every wave. When the final patch dried without splitting, Clara placed her palm against it. These patches will hold another 100 years. The room offered no answer. It did not need one. Doris Bell from the cafe began leaving paper bags on Clara's doorstep before sunrise. Doris wore her gray hair twisted beneath a red scarf and had a habit of folding the top of every bag exactly twice. Inside might be 2 biscuits, an apple, soup in a lidded jar, or yesterday's bread wrapped in wax paper. Clara finally caught her one morning. "I owe you." Doris shook her head. "In candles when the shop reopens." She walked away before Clara could ask what shop she meant. Caleb Turner arrived the next Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across his handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a fence rail, with one front tooth chipped diagonally. "I can split." Clara looked at the pile of oak rounds behind him. "What do you charge?" He shook his head. "My mother said. About your grandfather. That was all he offered. He split wood until noon." Reverend Boyd passed the forge each morning on his walk toward the small church beyond the mill road. He had a white beard that caught snow and carried a black umbrella even when the sky was clear. He never came inside, he merely tipped his hat. One morning, when Clara stood outside with plaster dust on both sleeves, he paused beside the gate. "May your hands endure," 4 words. Then he continued down the road. Clara postponed the cellar until February 11th. The stairs had looked unsafe from the day she arrived, and there had always been something more urgent above ground. There were 7 granite steps. She tested each before putting her full weight down. The cellar floor measured roughly 12 by 15 feet and was laid in irregular fieldstone worn smooth along a narrow path from the stairs to the furnace base. At the center sat one dressed granite slab unlike every other stone in the room. Its surface carried the same carved craft mark she had found near the walnut root, 3 lines beneath a narrow V. Clara swept around it. She did not lift it. Some doors did not need opening merely because they existed. Beneath the 3rd stair, her broom struck wood. A small oak box had been wedged deep behind the riser. Inside lay one brass key. Its bow had been shaped like a fencing foil guard, a tiny symmetrical loop worked into the metal. Beneath the key was a tintype. A young woman stood outside the forge in summer clothes, one hand resting on an anvil hammer. Clara sat down on the granite stair. The woman had Clara's narrow chin, the same straight eyebrows. Even the slight turn of the left shoulder looked familiar. On the back, scratched into a thin metal plate, were the words, "Clara Mercer, daughter of Edwin, age 25, summer of 1903. Clara read it twice, then she carried the key upstairs. She placed it on the mantel beneath the steel rose. She did not know what had opened. Snow withdrew from the property in uneven strips. The creek grew loud with meltwater. By late March, walnut catkins hung from the branches like small green cords, and mud replaced ice along the lane. Clara repaired shelves, oiled tools, sorted steel. She did not begin forging fencing blades, not yet. Miriam's manual remained open only when she had time to read slowly, and Clara decided that spring would belong to practice rather than production. She would spend 1 coin from the inheritance on steel, oil, charcoal, and simple test pieces. Nothing more. She cut short lengths of spring stock, heated them, bent them, broke some deliberately, recorded what happened. A workshop could survive another season without proving anything. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Clara stood before the forge hearth holding the first blade she was willing to call finished. It had taken 11 discarded attempts. The 12th lay across her palms. She had forged it from high-carbon spring steel, drawing the taper by repeated heats until the section narrowed evenly from foreday to tip. She normalized it 3 times, quenched it edgewise in warmed oil, and tempered it until the steel carried the flexibility Miriam's notes demanded. Then she tested it. The foil bent nearly 90 degrees against a padded wooden block. Clara released the pressure. The blade returned straight. Not perfectly straight enough. She checked it against the bench, no permanent set. Only then did she round the tip, polish away the last sharp edge, and fit a safe button over the end. She did not hang it on the wall. She put it in the rack with the tools. The forge no longer looked abandoned. The restored pine floor held lamplight in deep brown bands. 8 repaired windows admitted winter sun without rattling. The plaster showed its age honestly, smooth in places and gently uneven in others. The hearth drew clean. The old workbench remained scarred. Nothing gleamed more than it needed to. The brass key waited on the mantel for almost 2 years. Its answer came by accident. One cold afternoon, Clara was clearing dead growth from the oldest walnut tree when the edge of her pruning knife struck a metal beneath a curl of bark, not deep inside the trunk, set into it. A narrow brass plate almost completely grown over. At its center was a keyhole. Clara went inside, returned with the key. It fit. The plate released a small iron-lined compartment built into an old hollow and later concealed as the tree healed around it. Inside was a folded 48-star American flag, dry beneath waxed cloth. Beneath the flag lay a note dated October 7, 1918. The handwriting belonged to the young woman in the tintype. Clara Mercer, Edwin's daughter, Miriam's mother. The note had been written during the final weeks of the First World War, while influenza and casualty telegrams moved through Rhode Island households with almost equal dread. "Daniel has gone back to France," she had written. "Miriam keeps asking why the flag has so many stars if one family can feel so small. I have placed this here because a house should remember who did not come home, but it should not become a shrine to sorrow. If this tree lives, let it grow around the metal. Let the living wood decide how much should remain visible." Clara read the note beneath bare branches. The flag had 48 stars because Alaska and Hawaii were still decades from statehood. She carried both objects inside. The World War I Victory Medal from the Anvil cache finally received its place the following Memorial Day, May 26, 2025. Clara took it to Swan Point Cemetery in Providence. Daniel Vale's name had been entered on a family marker there after the war, though his body remained buried in France. She stood before the stone at 10 in the morning. No ceremony, no photographer. She laid the medal against the base of the marker beside a small sprig from the walnut tree, stayed several minutes, then returned the medal to its cloth wrapping. It belonged to the forge, but now it had been introduced properly. The money remained mostly untouched. Over those 2 years, Clara used only 4 coins from the cache. One paid for spring steel and quench oil, one covered replacement chimney flashing when the old lead finally tore. One purchased a used leg vise from a retiring machinist. The fourth paid the registration and safety inspection required before she could legally receive customers for repair work. The rest remained wrapped, not in the anvil. Clara built a small steel box, lined it with cedar, and placed the money inside with an inventory in her own handwriting. On the top sheet she wrote, "For the next one." The shop reopened without announcement. Doris gave Clara one corner of the cafe corkboard. Clara pinned up a white index card. Foil repair, small spring steel work, by appointment, Mercer Fencing Steel. No telephone number at first, only a mailing address. Within a year, the list in Clara's desk held more than 40 names. Some wanted old fencing blades straightened. Some mailed broken guards. Several merely wrote asking whether she could make a practice foil someday. She answered each by hand, not quickly, honestly. Caleb returned the following spring carrying something wrapped in an old bedsheet. By then he was taller. The chipped tooth remained. He leaned the bundle against the forge door, for the sign. Clara pulled away the cloth. He had carved a new wooden board in the style of the old one. Mercer Fencing Steel. The letters were deep and plain. Beneath them, in smaller type, Caleb had added 2 words, and daughters. Clara looked at him. Why daughters? Caleb shrugged, seemed overdue. She ran her thumb along the carved ampersand. There is only me. For now. He picked up his bicycle. Clara did not change the sign. They mounted it above the doors that afternoon. Years of winter had nearly erased the old lettering. The new words faced the road. That autumn, Clara began a letter. She chose heavy paper, sat beneath the lamp Miriam had once used, placed the steel rose beside her left hand. For several minutes she wrote nothing. Then she began, "My dear one, whoever you are." She described the roof, the chimney, the blade failures. The mistakes worth remembering. She recorded quench temperatures beside notes about weather because she had learned the room itself changed the work. She wrote where Walter's roofing hatchet hung, where the original 1788 pane should never be forced, which floorboard still creaked near the stove even after repair. She did not write how much money remained. That was listed elsewhere. Instead, she wrote, Do not mistake inheritance for permission to preserve everything unchanged. Use what works. Repair what can still serve. Replace what becomes dangerous. Leave records of your failures because success often hides the lesson. Near the end, she stopped. Outside, wind moved through the walnut branches. The old tree had grown another ring around the brass compartment. Clara looked at the foil resting in the rack, at Miriam's steel rose, at Elias's gauge. Then she wrote one sentence she had carried since childhood. A thing that bends has not necessarily failed. She folded the letter, not to hide it yet, just to see where the creases would fall. By then, the forge had become known quietly along the road. Doris still left bags sometimes, though Clara now paid for them. Walter had retired from the hardware store but came by on Wednesdays and criticized whatever tool Clara had most recently sharpened. Reverend Boyd no longer walked every morning. When he did, Clara stopped working long enough to raise one hand through the window. There were still leaks to watch, mortar to inspect, steel to ruin. Questions the old manuals did not answer. That was enough. On winter evenings, Clara sometimes opened the double doors after shutting down the hearth and stood outside while heat left the bricks slowly behind her. The new sign moved slightly in the wind. Beyond it stood the road. Beyond the road, houses whose lights came on one by one. The antique fencing foil forge waits. It has always waited, and in the county clerk's office, inside the old oak desk Margaret Haskell had used before retirement, one shallow drawer still stuck during humid weather. A new clerk eventually forced it open. Behind a stack of obsolete transfer forms lay a single worn dollar bill. Margaret had placed it there years before, one of Clara's original 7. She had substituted $1 of her own when balancing the county receipt that morning. No note explained why. The bill remained in the drawer.